Hey everybody, to kick this off, I want to get started with a brain teaser. Why do many more species of birds occur on the island of New Guinea than on the island of Bali? Well, it's a simple answer, and it's only a question of size. Okay? Papua New Guinea is a much larger area than Bali. Keep that in the back of your mind. Next question. The Hawaiian Islands are 10 times bigger than the Louisiade Islands, which are just off the coast of New Guinea. But the Hawaiian Islands have fewer native birds. Why might that be? Well, it's not size, and this time it's distance. If you look, Hawaii is pretty far away from the west coast, whereas the Louisiade Islands are right off the coast of New Guinea. These phenomena, the effects of size and distance, are a part of something that we'll refer to as island biogeography theory. And island biogeography theory explores this question: how biodiversity varies in a fragmented habitat. And when I say fragmented habitat, we loosely use the term island to refer to a fragmented habitat. And the size of the island and the distance of that island from the mainland is going to impact how much biodiversity is there. And I encourage you to think very liberally about what the term island might refer to. We'll see in a minute. So islands, why we focus on islands, they are case studies for looking at biodiversity and evolution, and there are a lot of reasons why. First of all, they're a new land that's being colonized by species from far away. Island, that term, like I said, applies to more habitats than you may realize. Right? Any habitat that's been fragmented, whether it's by farming or by the development of suburbs or neighborhoods, you can see little fragments, little patches of habitat that we could refer to as islands. Just because they're not land surrounded by sea doesn't mean they aren't islands in their own way, and you can see those same islands here. Islands also have oftentimes limited resources because there's limited space, which means there's probably going to be limited food. That's going to lead to competition and eventually specialization, the development of specialist species, and lots of resource partitioning, so we can see some really unique, interesting adaptations going on there. These smaller areas tend to be vulnerable to takeover and domination by invasive species, and they often provide interesting case studies in a phenomenon known as convergent evolution, which is basically this idea that if organisms are experiencing the same pressures from the environment, they can or will evolve similar adaptations even though they don't share a common ancestry. So sharks, which are fish, penguins, which are birds, and dolphins, which are mammals, have all evolved flippers to swim in the water. They have a similar environment. Bats, birds, and butterflies all have different bone structures and different ancestries, but they've all evolved wings to fly. So islands oftentimes provide interesting looks at convergent evolution. So let's dig a little bit deeper now into this idea of island biogeography theory. I just explained to you why islands are so interesting to look at, but let's take a look at this theory in depth. Island biogeography theory is just a way that we can understand patterns of biodiversity across island ecosystems, whether it's actual islands in the ocean or patches of forest in the neighborhood. Let's break it down. It can look pretty complicated, but we're going to break it down piece by piece. So we've established that biodiversity is the number of unique species in an area, in this case on the island. And that island biodiversity is going to depend on two main factors. One, how many new species are being added? That's we can look at as immigration. How many species are migrating, immigrating to that island? And the opposite, how many species are leaving, but not via emigration, via extinction, the number of species subtracted. So we can think about these two rates, the immigration rate and the extinction rate, as influencing the island biodiversity. Now, immigration and extinction rates themselves are going to fluctuate, and they will fluctuate because of our old friend competition. And when two organisms are competing over the same space, the same resources, etc., it's going to have a negative impact on both individuals. And it's going to change the way that immigration and extinction rates fluctuate. For example, the higher the competition in an area, the harder it is to immigrate successfully. It's going to be a lot harder for a species to move to a new island, set up shop, so to speak, start a population and survive if there are a lot of other species living there already. So let's graph that pattern. On the x-axis, I'll put species richness here, number of unique species, and we can assume that as the number of species goes up, competition is going to go up. More species putting more demand on limited resources like food, space, nutrients, mates, etc. And what we see if we put immigration rate on the y-axis with this pattern, as species richness goes up, as competition increases, the immigration rate will decrease. The opposite is true with extinction. As the competition increases, it will be easier for a species to go extinct because there are limited resources and there's a higher likelihood that someone is going to lose out in that battle to the point where they might actually go extinct. The whole population might die. So if we graph extinction rate in red on the right axis, we'll see that as competition increases, extinction rate increases. So two different relationships going on here, and we're going to throw one more wrinkle into it. Or I guess maybe two more wrinkles, depending on how you look at it. But before we do that, this point right here, this point where these two lines cross over, they intersect, is what we'll refer to as the equilibrium point. When the input from immigration is equal to the output from extinction, that's the equilibrium point. In theory, the species richness will stay constant at this point. It doesn't mean that species aren't immigrating or aren't going extinct. It just means it's happening at an equal rate. So the makeup of the species may change. We'll see some turnover perhaps, but the overall number of species should stay the same. However, this equilibrium is very unstable. It can very easily get disrupted by a natural disaster, an invasive species, a slight change in the resources that are available, etc. Okay, so now I'm going to throw another wrinkle into this graph here. Two factors will affect extinction and immigration rates. And you already know what they are, because I talked about them at the very start of the video: size and distance. So distance from the mainland is going to impact the extinction and immigration rates. Islands that are closer to the mainland, think Hawaii being very far from the coast of the US, islands that are closer will have higher immigration rates. Why? Well, there's less distance to travel from the mainland to an island when it's closer. It's easier to get there. It's easier to move to a new place when it's nearby. As opposed to size, we'll see a similar sort of situation where it's easier to set up shop on a larger island, and it's easier to survive on a larger island. So extinction rates are going to be smaller on a larger island because there is more resources available, more space, more food, so there'll be less resource competition, there'll be more niche development, and there'll be a little bit more room for everybody to breathe, so extinction rates will go lower. This can be represented with the two simple graphs. If we look at distance from the mainland, as the island's distance from the mainland increases, as we get further and further away, in general, the number of species on that island tends to decrease. We see something opposite with the size of the island. As the size of the island increases, we tend to see an increase in the number of species that can survive there. So here's a more visual cartoon to look at. Here's that distance effect. The closer an island is, the easier it is for a species to settle there. The larger an island is, the easier it is to land there, and also the more room there is for everybody to survive. So proportionally and generally speaking, fewer species will go extinct on a larger island. Okay, so let's incorporate this into our graph. And this is where it starts to get a little funky looking. But just pay attention to that breakdown. One step at a time, it'll make sense, right? So I said that as the island gets closer to the shore, immigration rate will increase. So we can represent that with a second green line. Islands that are closer will have higher immigration rates overall compared to islands that are farther away, which will have lower immigration rates overall. But they both decrease as competition increases. You can see that. You might be able to guess what's about to happen next. I talked about island size and extinction rate. Well, small islands tend to have higher extinction rates because there's less room for everybody to hang out, and big islands tend to have lower extinction rates. Again, we still see them both increasing as competition increases, but at different rates. And this graph represents island biogeography theory in a nutshell. Distance from the mainland, size of the island are the two main factors affecting extinction and immigration rate, with the extra added twist of competition. Here's an actual graph as opposed to one I made in PowerPoint. The immigration rate, they call it colonization rate, but I don't like that term. Immigration rate is in blue, and extinction rate is in green. And you can see that islands that are closer to the mainland have a higher immigration rate, and islands that are farther have a lower immigration rate overall. Islands that are larger have a lower extinction rate, whereas islands that are smaller have a higher extinction rate. And we've got 4 different equilibrium points here representing 4 different types of islands. This is a large island that is close to the mainland. A large island close to the mainland is going to support the highest biodiversity, because if you look down to the x-axis, this is the highest biodiversity. The lowest biodiversity is a small island that is far from the mainland. It's hard to get to and it's hard to survive. And again, if you look down at the x-axis, it's got the lowest biodiversity. Same chart, slightly different design. You can see it focuses in on these equilibrium points a little bit more clearly. And you can see a large island close to the shore is going to have the highest number of species present. Small island far from the shore is going to have the lowest number of species present. This graph, keep in mind, is all theoretical, so depending on the island, depending on the ecosystem, these equilibrium points may be at different locations. But this pattern has been shown to exist in nature. Last thing I want to mention is that I talked about how island biogeography provides some interesting case studies in evolution, looking at convergent evolution, and I want to make these points explicit because the AP curriculum does so. Again, on islands, there are limited resources. It's not like an infinite landmass. There are limited space, limited food, limited habitats. That's going to lead to increased competition, which is going to lead to increased resource partitioning, which ultimately will lead to the evolution of specialist species, organisms that specialize on one particular habitat or one particular food source. What that means, however, though, is specialist species tend to be more vulnerable to changes in the habitat. If I eat only one type of grass and something comes along, maybe it's a disturbance, maybe it's an invasive species, maybe it's a natural disaster, and for some reason it wipes out that population of grass, suddenly I have no food and I have nowhere to turn. I will die. And so invasive species, which tend to be generalist species, oftentimes can shift these ecosystems, these island ecosystems, and outperform these highly evolved specialists. Lastly, when we look at immigration to islands, we see inherently a bottleneck effect, which means that islands are starting with a reduced gene pool, which means that evolution can happen at much sort of faster or higher rates. And the last thing I want to leave you with, and we'll talk about this in class next time, is that humans have a huge impact on fragmenting habitat and formation of islands, not just through like man-made islands, for example, but like I said earlier, development of neighborhoods, deforestation, farmland, etc. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. This graph looks intimidating, but if you break it down one piece at a time, it's not too bad. If you've got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next time.